Hello, everybody. This is the Unit 4 concept review for the AP Euro test. As it says at the bottom there, this will be scientific, philosophical, and political developments of this era, which is going to be 17th and 18th century, mainly 17th. Okay. So again, the context as we lead into this new topic, this new content, the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, you're kind of looking at this as a shift in time periods for sure, right? That the Renaissance, like it says there, has kind of run its course. All the ancient manuscripts and philosophies and ideas that were out there to be discovered, they've been discovered, but certainly the Renaissance had its limitations, right? The ancient Romans, the ancient Greeks, they didn't have the whole world figured out. And so after the Renaissance has brought back society to a more educated kind of basis, now it's looking forward, right? What is next? What else is out there that we haven't figured out yet, that neither us nor the ancient Roman and Greeks had gotten to. So when we're looking at just new conceptions on how we approach problems as a society or as a scientific community, looking at rational thinking, right? Looking for objective evidence rather than subjective evidence, and looking to have, facts and basis and science behind the thoughts and ideas of the time. And so this is, of course, clashing with traditional, maybe religiously oriented modes of thinking, right? That the church has been kind of the arbiter of information and education for a long, long time. Certain authorities have been in power for centuries, and they are not going to like their ideas and their concepts being challenged. Like a lot of these early topics, making sure we understand how important the printing press is when it comes to spreading these ideas, right? Be that the Reformation or this, the Enlightenment stuff. Printing press is absolutely a root of all these things. These ideas cannot spread with the speed they spread without ink and paper. As we get further and further and closer to the modern day, right, we as a society move away from the idea of one true religion, at least as far as like Europe is concerned, right? That no more is Europe going to be able to say that they are, overwhelmingly, predominantly Catholic. And as the Reformation happens and these different denominations branch off from Catholicism, it's just, the cat's out of the bag, so to speak, and then they will branch and branch and branch. And then you think about today, April 23rd, 2020, there are, innumerable numbers of religious denominations. 4.2, the scientific revolution, right? So we, again, are in an era where the preconceived notions of science and how the universe and how the earth works have been around for a long, long time, and those are being challenged, right? And now people are using different ways of coming up with new theories on the way the world works, the way the universe works. So our, a prime example here would be like heliocentrism versus geocentrism, right? Heliocentrism, that the sun is the center of the solar system, and that geocentrism is that the earth is the center of the solar system, right? And that objective versus subjective idea, that subjectively, it seems like we, the earth, are in the center of the universe because we see the sun and the moon move and revolve in the sky, or rotate in the sky, I should say, or no, revolves, right? And from our subjective point of view, I'm standing still out on the sidewalk or whatever, and I see the sun move across the sky and fall below the horizon, then subjectively, I'm stationary and the sun is moving, right? But of course, we know that's not the case. But, thinking about the difficulty of challenging that notion, of challenging your eyes, right? That if I don't understand the way science works, and I've been taught these things, it's gonna be very difficult to convince me that I am in fact moving and the sun is stationary whenever I have that evidence right in front of me. So that quick definition, right? Subjective is based off of your experiences or maybe your opinion. Objective is going to be scientific fact. As we get into that bottom bullet right there, right? Balance between a universe controlled by the laws of science, math, and physics versus one controlled by spiritual religious forces, this clash between science and faith, that as we move forward and forward and forward, in new ways or new, you know, laws of physics and laws of science are being introduced and proposed, there is that kind of internal battle that people have to face as individuals, but also the one that societies have to face, right? What do we prioritize? What do we look to when we have problems? 4.3, the Enlightenment. Just one part you could say a large scale rise of learning, right? That society as a whole is going up as far as kind of that basic level of understanding of the world. And so this is a combination of all these things we just talked about, the scientific revolution, but combining them with society and human nature, right? So, a big part would be, like we talked about a lot this year, Voltaire and religious toleration, that maybe we figured out that trying to force millions upon millions of people to conform to one type of religion doesn't really work, right? That wars and conflict and revolts become inevitable when you do that. And so an enlightened view, right, is that sort of idea of live and let live a little bit when it comes to religion. Not that I have to necessarily like and agree with and respect or anything your religion, but I'm going to tolerate it because we're not going to convince one another that you're right and I'm wrong, or vice versa. When we look at the Enlightenment applied to governments and how they relate to society, right, with John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the natural God-given or nature-given rights and the social contract, that I have certain endowed rights that nobody can take from me. I have the right to live, I have the right of liberty, and I have the right to property. And if my government is to encroach any of these rights, I have the opportunity, or I should say I have the responsibility to overthrow that government, because a government that infringes on my rights would be tyrannical, right? And so when we're looking at this, when we think about natural rights, God-given rights, governments are, even if you're looking at this as separation in church versus state, governments cannot infringe on those rights because those rights are naturally endowed with us, right? And if those governments didn't give us those rights, then they certainly can't take them away, right? A government does not give you the right to live. You already have that right. Like usual, right until, basically all the units we're going to cover for this test on May 13th, women are going to have a hard time being accepted into these movements, right? Because there's still those very strong, strict gender roles taking place in Western society. So, looking into female Enlightenment philosophers, Mary Wollstonecraft is always kind of the go-to. But if you remember, we talked a little bit about, when she writes about how, I would be upset with a system that cuts off half the population, so to speak, right? If women are 50% of the population and you want to live in a more enlightened society, it doesn't make a lot of sense that you would keep half your population in the dark, so to speak, right? But just remember, even if this is a more liberal, free-thinking time, there are, still some strict limits on that for the moment. If you take the Enlightenment and apply that to the economy, right? The idea of free trade and free market, Adam Smith and laissez-faire economics, that governments should stay out of the economy, that it is not the government's job, or even it doesn't benefit the economy as a whole for the government to get involved with the economy and to pick and choose winners, right? To let the free market decide who will be successful, right? If I have a good business idea and I have a good price point, then the market will find me successful, right? Because people will spend their money with me. Looking at more, maybe philosophical or spiritual things, deism, skepticism, atheism, these ideas are starting to come into play, right? And deism, as a reminder, is the belief that there is a higher power, but maybe not any kind of specific knowledge or acceptance of, again, specifics, right? That it is a monotheistic or polytheistic, or it's meant to be a male or a female or whatever, right? It's just the idea that it's there. But I don't necessarily believe in intervention or anything like that. Skepticism, just that kind of idea of questioning things rather than just accepting them, you tell me a quote unquote fact, I don't just take that immediately. I don't just accept that as 100% true until I have proven that myself, right? That I'm not going to just accept knowledge and ideas and theories just because the person telling me them is important. Then, of course, atheism, the lack of a belief in any higher power. So when we say that bottom bullet, religion shifts to a private matter over a public matter, that your internal, things you do in your own home, the things you think about your religion in your own mind, your own heart, become obviously your responsibility and only your concern. And it's no longer just about marching to the church, twice a week at a certain time and going through the same prayers and going through the same rituals, as that being a way to prove your piety, right? Your piety. So, think about today in modern religion. Obviously, people go to church and people worship in public. For the most part, it's a little different time, but it certainly is religion as a private matter, right? You pray to yourself, those kinds of things, right? And you have your own internal interpretations of God or gods or whatever it is. And that's not necessarily anybody else's business. 4.4, 18th century society and demographics. Farming has gotten better, right? And railroads are slowly, I shouldn't say railroads, but better transportation are coming into play, right? And that means less people are needed to farm. More people are now having to go to the cities to find work because there's not as many jobs available in rural Europe, and populations are continuing to grow, right? So, naturally from basically the Renaissance on, cities are continually growing and getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so you think about how society changes when you have larger cities. A plane flying overhead. I live kind of close to the airport here, so hopefully you can't hear that. But again, you think about lack of infrastructure. You think about not having enough homes, not having enough jobs, not having enough food, not having enough, ability to get rid of refuse. So you have pollution issues. And then, of course, if you have a lot of people who are impoverished and don't have a job and don't have any ways of supporting themselves and or their families, crime goes up, right? And when crime goes up, all the problems and the effects that has. And so you think about the rise of city police, right? That these entities are there to protect the people who have stuff from the people who don't have stuff, essentially. And, when you're thinking about modern society, how much of our modern society is based around us living in cities or pretty big towns, right? I mean, there are, of course, people who don't live in a city or a town and kind of live out in the middle of nowhere, but that number is dwindling, right? And even you think about a city like Guthrie or Enid or Woodward or something, they're not big towns, but there's still thousands of people living there and thousands of people working there and going to school there, and creating an actual town, a city. And so thinking about just how many people used to not live in any sort of center like that, right? Didn't live in any kind of town. They lived very, isolated lives. Okay, health is getting better, right? The plague has disappeared. Vaccinations are starting to come around. And when we have all this combination, we have a societal change in that child rearing or the raising of a child becomes an important factor in a person's life. And so for a long time, when you have child mortality rates are very high, right? And if you were to have, 4 or 5 kids, you can pretty well guarantee that 1 or 2 of them is probably going to get ill and not survive past, childhood. And if that becomes that kind of fact of life, it certainly is going to probably change your relationship with your kid. And, maybe this isn't the best example, but an example I've given in the past is, if you were looking into buying a puppy and you knew that puppy was only going to live for 2 or 3 months before something was going to happen to it, I probably wouldn't want to buy that puppy because I wouldn't want to get attached to it, right? I wouldn't want to fall in love with it, quote unquote, and then be destroyed when something bad happened to it. And it's kind of the same thing if you have 4 or 5 children. Going through the emotional struggle of getting very attached to your child and then dealing with the illness and the death that follows it, that's a hard thing to deal with. And so I'm going to kind of shield myself from those emotions, right? And so as child mortality decreases, that shift becomes, how can I best benefit my child for a healthy adulthood, right? So you start seeing childhood education come into the fray a little bit. You see more importance placed on, having a child learn and play and grow when they're young. Jean-Jacques Rousseau talks a lot about breastfeeding as, a way for parents and children to become closer, as opposed to the what are they called, wet nurses and things like that, and where, especially wealthy women would not breastfeed their children. They'd have some other woman do it. 4.5, which I didn't put the number on there, but it's 18th century culture and arts. And so, beyond just education and the printing press, thinking about how many opportunities there are to have information disseminated to you, right? Between magazines and essays and pamphlets and posters or whatever, right? It's just a constant bombardment of information. Think about how many things, if you're out driving around, how many billboards and even radio ads and everything else that you're just hit over the head with, and you go through without even thinking about it now, right? You just absorb information all the time. So I mentioned this in the last video because I got confused, I guess, on my slides, but paintings represent art, or excuse me, paintings represent life for sure. Art represents life. And so as we get into this more commercial time, you start to see a lot more domestic scenes in painting, right? A lot more everyday things. And now painting is not just religious figures and kings and big important events, right? You start to see a little domesticity in art. This is in the heart of colonialism, 1700s. Africa, Asia, the New World, North and South America are all being, controlled and slowly taken over by European states, and being exposed to these different cultures and different philosophies and different perspectives of life. They certainly challenge your norms, right? And if you travel and or read or watch movies or anything else, very different cultures than, say, Oklahoma or middle America, you find out pretty quick the world is not like it is here everywhere else, right? And again, you start thinking about those big picture things, is no matter what your religion is, your culture, your language, as far as the world is concerned, you're in a minority, right? Everybody is. There is no language or culture or anything else that is half of the world's population or more. And the more you're aware of that, the more maybe skeptical you are about your culture and your knowledge. That last bullet there, right? We've talked about this before with the Renaissance, that idea of leisure time, that you have a handful of people who make enough money, are comfortable enough that they have hours a day where they can kind of relax and choose what hobby they want to occupy their time. And as the market economy increases and more people make wages, you have a larger and larger percentage of people who do have those private lives, who aren't working all day long, and they do have those leisure opportunities. And so you start to see the rise of concerts. We're slowly getting to the point where, they'll start having sporting events and people will pay for a ticket, going to a play, going to any kind of event. Those things didn't really happen hundreds of years ago because people didn't have the time to do them, right? Except for the extremely, extremely wealthy. But now, as more and more people are finding some success in a more modern economy, those opportunities open up, right? That I can go once a month to a concert, or I can go to the play, or whatever it is, because I've got a little bit of money, but more importantly, I've got a little bit of time, right? And then you think about the jobs that open up from that. Think about even today, when we could go to sporting events and things, how many people are employed and that's their job in that entity, right? The guy who works the concession stands, the people who run, are in charge of, cleaning the stadium after it's over, right? A lot of people, that is their job, and those jobs literally didn't exist, decades ago. Here's this painting that I was assuming was going to be in my last slides when I talked about Dutch Golden Age. But, here's a very simple painting, right? A husband, a wife, their child, definitely can tell that all three of them aren't lacking for food, right? Not only is there food on their plate, but there's obviously been some food in their bellies. And this is just a very simplistic domestic scene. They are not working. They're not toiling in the fields. They're not, worshiping. They're just living. And that, again, that kind of reflects, and this is certainly an upper, or at least a middle class family, but it represents, again, this kind of new society that we're looking at. 4.6, enlightened and other approaches to power. So this is mainly about enlightened absolutism, right? And combining or synthesizing absolute monarchy and enlightened conceptions, especially with religion, right? So your enlightened monarchs largely are going to be the ones who adopt religious toleration. So, you know, toleration doesn't mean they're going to invite every single type of religion in the world out there. It's primarily to do with Christianity, but it's the strategy or the idea that it's probably not worth trying to coalesce all these differences in one big religion, Christianity, because we're just going to deal with the issues and all the money we're going to have to spend on putting down these revolts and so on, right? And looking at the results of countries that adopt this kind of tolerant mindset is, you know, you look at Prussia, Frederick the Great, who was certainly an enlightened monarch, right? And I'm probably butchering this quote, but, you know, he has a quote about enlightened absolutism, or about himself, that you can apply to enlightened absolutism, which I think is about perfect for this. And it's something along the lines of, you can believe what you wish, but you will obey, right? That in the privacy of your own home and your own mind and your own conscience, then you can think about whatever you want about religion. But as far as laws and things like that, this is the way it is, right? So it's certainly not a kinder, nicer approach or anything. It's still very strict and it's absolute power, but it has that enlightened idea to it, right? And so some long-term results. You know, countries that are dealing with never-ending religious wars, they might be struggling because they're spending, again, more money and manpower trying to put down these revolts and put down these conflicts than countries who aren't dealing with them. But when we have this rise in religious toleration, the Holy Roman Empire will start to decline because, again, the Holy Roman Empire is this combination of dozens and dozens of small German states, some bigger than others or some smaller than others. And as religious toleration becomes the norm, there's that natural fracture, right? Where you know, I don't know what percentage exactly, their princes or their leaders convert to Protestantism or Lutheranism, and now the HRE is weaker, right? And then Prussia, you know, they will be able to gain people because they have this religious toleration. And, you know, as of course we get into the 1800s, Prussia becomes a very, very powerful country and eventually will unify Germany. Okay, well, that's it. Thanks for watching Unit 4. That's the longest one yet. It'll be almost at 25 minutes. I hope you enjoyed it. If you made it through, congratulations. I will see you guys soon.